Boa noite, estamos ao vivo com mais uma sessão do Janelas Filosóficas. Aqui hoje nós temos o professor David Horst, que vai nos agraciar com uma palestra sobre racionalidade doxástica. E para debater o assunto nós temos o professor Rogério Severo, e os nossos estudantes de mestrado, Vinicius, Rodrigues e o Pedro. Antes de mais nada, muito boa noite e obrigado por assistirem essa palestra. Muito boa noite a vocês que estão aqui e muito obrigado pela participação de todo mundo. A palestra vai ser feita em inglês, tá? A todos os desavisados, a gente já deixou avisado isso, mas toda a discussão vai ser feita em português, então tranquilo, toda a discussão vai ser um pouco mais tranquila de entender, eu acredito. Mas sem mais delongas, eu vou passar agora para o professor David.
Então, muito obrigado pelo convite, boa noite. Eu vou falar em inglês, mas como o Horst já disse, todas as perguntas podem ser em português. Então, vocês podem ver a minha tela? Ótimo. So, my current research focuses on two notions. The first one is rationality, and the second one is virtue, in particular epistemic or doxastic virtue. And in this talk, I'll be trying to bring these two notions together. In particular, I'll be arguing that a particular or a proper account of doxastic rationality will be a conception of rational believers as doxastically virtuous believers. So in form of a slogan, my claim tonight will be that rational believers are doxastically virtuous believers. And I will begin with a brief introduction into the notion of doxastic rationality. So, according to a fairly widespread view in contemporary epistemology, rational believers are immediately responsive to their evidence. And there are a few examples from the recent literature. So, for example, David Wellman says that when we discern a gap between a belief and the truth, the belief immediately becomes unsettled and begins to change. Tom Kelly writes, it's characteristic of rational thinkers to respect their evidence, insofar as one is rational, one is disposed to respond appropriately to one's evidence. And Scanlon writes, a rational person who judges there to be sufficient grounds for believing that P normally has that belief, and this judgment is normally sufficient explanation for so believing. And last but not least, Joseph Raz writes that there is no gap, no extra step in reasoning between believing that the case for the truth of a proposition is conclusive and believing the proposition. So there's certainly important differences between the remarks of these authors, but I think the main gist of their remarks can be captured in the following principle, which I've dubbed immediate responsiveness, or IR, according to which, normally, rational believers are immediately responsive to their evidence, and that A, if they possess sufficient evidence for P, then other things equal, this is sufficient for them to believe P, and B, if they possess sufficient evidence against P, then other things equal, this is sufficient for them to believe not P. And for the purposes of this talk, I will take immediate responsiveness as true, or I'll take it for granted, even though it's not entirely uncontroversial. For the purposes of this talk, I will just assume that something like immediate responsiveness is indeed correct. And my question instead will be how we have to conceive of rational believers and their way of belief formation such that IR comes out true. So in other terms, what ensures that believers are immediately responsive to their evidence such that they merit the title rational? And there are two answers that are based on popular views about belief more generally in the literature, which I will be considering. The first one is what we may call the teleological account, according to which rational believers are immediately responsive to their evidence because they aim at truth in some sense. Second account is the normative account, according to which rational believers are immediately responsive to their evidence because belief is constitutively subject to a truth norm. And this is something that rational believers necessarily recognize or accept. Now, my aim today is to show that both of these views face significant problems. And this then will motivate the introduction of my alternative account, which I call virtue account, according to which rational believers are immediately responsive to their evidence because when forming beliefs in this way, they exercise a relevant doxastic virtue. So on my view, the key to understanding rational belief formation in a way that is capable of vindicating IR, immediate responsiveness, is to view such belief formation as an exercise or as a manifestation of a certain kind of virtue, right? So then the structure of my talk is as follows. First, I will very briefly add some comments on the principle immediate responsiveness. Then I will discuss the teleological account and the normative account. And then in the last main part of the talk, I will introduce and defend my own proposal, the virtue account. So there are, of course, a number of things that one might and probably should say about the various notions involved in IR. I will limit myself to highlighting that, or to saying something about what I mean by immediate responsiveness, because that's particularly important for what follows. So by immediate responsiveness, I mean that normally possessing sufficient evidence for or against P is motivationally sufficient for rational believers to actually believe P or believe not P. So, for example, suppose you you believe that it'll rain tomorrow, but then come into possession of sufficient evidence that it will not rain tomorrow. And so far as you're rational, you will respond to the change in your evidence by updating your beliefs in such a way that your beliefs reflect your new or your changed evidential situation. And you will do so, importantly, regardless of whether or not, I mean, at least insofar you're rational, you will do so regardless of whether or not you have any independent or external incentive to follow your evidence, right? For rational believers, possession of sufficient evidence for or against P is typically enough for them to actually form the belief that P or the belief that not P. With regards to the notion of evidence, I want to remain as neutral as possible. So I don't take a stand, and it's not necessary for the purposes of my argument to take a stand on whether or not we should understand evidence along internalist or externalist lines, whether we should understand evidence in terms of non-factive mental states or rather in terms of facts or true propositions. Same goes for evidence possession. I will for the purpose of this talk, I will remain as neutral as possible on how we flesh out this notion. Similarly, I'm not taking a stand here on, and I think IR is in fact compatible with, or doesn't commit one to taking a stand on whether or not there are practical reasons for belief. Okay, so let's move on to considering the first of the two standard accounts that I'll be discussing. First one is the teleological account, and this account of rational belief formation builds on a very popular idea among not just epistemologists, but I mean philosophers more generally, according to which beliefs aim at truth, right? Often this is used as a slogan, but when pressed, philosophers tend to try to flesh this out in either of two ways, either in intentional terms or in functional terms. So either aiming at truth is understood in terms of an explicit intention to believe the truth, or this is understood in functional terms, such that beliefs aim at truth in the sense that they are typically the product or the result of a cognitive system whose function is to generate true beliefs. And for reasons of time, I will only focus here on the first way of fleshing out aim talk, namely on the intentional account. So according to the intentional account, rational belief formation is admittedly evidence responsive because when forming beliefs in this way, you intend to believe the truth. This view crucially relies on an analogy between, on the one hand, rational belief formation and, on the other hand, how ordinary intentions explain our responsiveness to certain considerations. So consider the following example. Suppose you're a tourist in Paris intending to visit the Louvre. I mean, suppose that's from a time when there was still tourism. Upon seeing a sign indicating that the line to enter the museum, to enter the Louvre, is to your left, you respond by turning left and take your place in the line. Now, what explains why you respond in this way is your intention to visit the Louvre, right? Simple case. Now, according to the teleological account, or more specifically the intentional account, something similar holds in the case of rational belief formation. So upon acquiring sufficient evidence indicating the truth of P, you respond by believing P. And what explains why you respond in this way is your intention to believe the truth, right? That's the basic idea of the intentional account. Our responsiveness to our evidence is grounded in an intention to believe the truth, just like our responsiveness to various practical considerations is at least often grounded in all kinds of practical intentions, right? Now, I think the main problem with this account is that this analogy between rational belief formation and the way in which ordinary intentions dispose us to respond to certain factors in our situations, this analogy generates wrong predictions. Now, to bring this out, consider first that in general, ordinary intentions dispose you to respond to considerations that bear on their fulfillment, but they do so in a way that can be defeated by other aims that you're pursuing. To illustrate this, consider the following elaboration on our previous example. Suppose the line in front of the Louvre is huge. If so, despite recognizing that waiting in the line is the only way to enter the museum, you might not take your place in the line. Perhaps you hate waiting in lines and you decide that you can spend your precious vacation time better in some other way, right? So in that case, you may give up on visiting the Louvre because doing so would frustrate other aims that you're pursuing. So what this illustrates, once again, is that ordinary intentions dispose us to respond to certain considerations, but they do so in a way that can be defeated by other purposes, by other aims, by other intentions that we have, right? Now, given the intentional account, then we should expect that something similar holds for the case of rational belief formation. In particular, we should expect that there are situations in which you refrain from responding to your evidence because doing so would frustrate certain other aims that you're pursuing. For example, suppose that believing that your partner is unfaithful would make you unhappy, and you prefer happiness over truth. If so, even if you had excellent evidence for your partner's infidelity, given the intentional account, we should expect that you would refrain from believing that your partner is unfaithful, right? Because in that case, you prefer happiness over truth. But of course, this is the wrong prediction. If something like IR is indeed true, then when a rational believer has sufficient evidence for P, she will respond by believing P, regardless of whether or not she has any other aims that might be frustrated by adopting this belief. There might be some ways of trying to improve on the intentional account. For the sake of time, I will skip that here. We may come back to this issue during Q&A if someone is interested in possible ways of improving on the intentional account. But the upshot is that the intentional account, since it is built on an analogy between rational belief formation and the way in which our ordinary intentions dispose us to respond to certain considerations, this account fails because this analogy generates a number of wrong predictions. Now, the normative account. The normative account is built, again, on a very popular idea among many philosophers, namely that belief is constitutively subject to a norm of truth. And this, one might plausibly think, provides us with this idea that belief is constitutively subject to a norm of truth. This idea provides us with the material for an adequate account of rational belief formation that is capable of vindicating IR. And such an account would roughly be the following. Rational belief formation is immediately evidence responsive because belief is subject to a constitutive norm of truth. And rational believers necessarily recognize or accept this. This account makes two claims. First one is that it is part of what it is for an attitude to be a belief that it is subject to a norm of truth, such that a belief is correct if and only if it is true. And second, that rational believers are such that they recognize or accept that beliefs are correct if and only if they are true. Now, the question for us is whether or not 1 and 2 really do imply that we are, or that rational believers are immediately responsive to their evidence. Or more precisely, our question is, given that you recognize or accept that believing P would be correct if and only if P were true, does this ensure that if you encountered sufficient evidence for P, you would immediately respond by believing P, right? And I think the answer is clearly no. Because being subject to a constitutive norm doesn't necessarily imply that one is moved by considerations that bear on how to comply with that norm, right? And here's an example to bring this out. Many philosophers think that assertion is subject to a constitutive norm of truth, such that affirming P is correct if and only if P is true. But it does not follow that, I mean, even if that's true, it does not follow that you can't affirm, or that it is in any way difficult to affirm P while recognizing or accepting that affirming P is incorrect. I mean, after all, lying is possible, right? I mean, that's exactly what you do. You affirm P, even though you have clear evidence that P is not true, right? You do something that is incorrect in light of the alleged constitutive norm for assertions. But I mean, this is certainly possible, and there's no difficulty in doing so. So what this brings out is that it's hard to see how the mere fact that belief is subject to a constitutive norm of truth could explain why, if you possessed sufficient evidence for P, you would normally believe P, right? But that's what the normative account was trying to do. Now, a natural way to attempt to improve on the normative account would be to say that, well, I mean, rational believers do not merely recognize or accept the fact that beliefs are constitutively subject to a truth norm. They also, in some way, aim to comply with that norm. And that is what motivates them to respond to considerations that bear on whether or not a given belief is correct. The problem with this, with the response, or with this attempt to improve on the normative account, is that it clearly shifts the explanatory burden from constitutive norms to aim directness, right? And so it inherits all the problems of the teleological account that we discussed earlier. Now, I'm not claiming that these brief considerations show that the teleological account or the normative account are hopeless. But I think the previous considerations do enough to motivate looking for an alternative account of rational belief formation that is capable of vindicating the IR principle. And what I want to do in the rest of this talk is defend the following proposal. Namely that the key to an account of rational belief formation that is capable of indicating IR is to view such belief formation as an exercise of doxastic virtue. So my proposal is the following, that rational belief formation is immediately evidence responsive because when forming beliefs in this way, you exercise or manifest a relevant doxastic virtue. The basic idea here is that rational believers are immediately evidence responsive, not because they intend to believe the truth, nor because they recognize that belief is subject to a constitutive norm of truth, but because they possess a certain doxastic virtue. So, on my view, the doxastic power at work in rational belief formation belongs to a more abstract category of power, other instances of which are familiar moral or ethical virtues, such as justice or benevolence or courage. So I've drawn a bit of a pathetic picture that's supposed to illustrate the structure of my account. So, so my idea is that it's possible to specify a generic notion of virtue, and doxastic virtues and ethical virtues are species of this general notion of virtue, right? And to flesh this out, I will do two things. First, I'll sketch an account of virtue in general, right? And then second, I'll argue that by viewing a rational believer's belief-forming powers as a kind of virtue, as a species of virtue, we can actually get an illuminating account of IR, right? An illuminating account, or an account of rational belief formation that is capable of vindicating the IR principle. So let's start with virtue in general. I'm taking a broadly Aristotelian approach here, and in particular, I'll introduce the notion of virtue by contrasting or by comparing it with the notion of skill, because I think that the distinguishing features of virtue, the ones that distinguish virtue from skill, are precisely the ones that turn out to be helpful in giving an account of rational belief formation that is capable of indicating IR. So first I'll consider some similarities between virtue and skill, and then I turn to their differences. So I take it that virtue and skill are both certain kinds of excellences. Excellences are powers that dispose their subjects or their possessors to reliably perform well within a certain domain under appropriate conditions, of course. Where performing well typically is a matter of responding to considerations that bear on what counts as getting things right in the relevant domain, that is relative to the fundamental norms of, or fundamental standards of that domain. So, for example, consider a skilled chess player. A skilled chess player is someone who's capable of performing well within the domain of chess, typically by performing chess moves in response to considerations such as the position of the pieces, the available moves, etc., that bear on the fundamental norm or aim of chess, which I take to be checkmating one's opponent. Now, an example of a virtuous person, consider a kind person. A kind person is someone who is disposed to perform well within the domain of kindness, roughly the sphere of other people's needs. Typically, by acting in response to considerations such as another person's suffering that bear on the fundamental norm of kindness, roughly to help others in need. So far, so similar. Now let's consider how virtues and skills differ. And to bring this out, I've put two examples on the handout. The first one is an example from the domain of chess. So while playing chess, you may recognize that moving your knight in a certain way would be an excellent chess move. Still, you might not move your knight. This wouldn't automatically call into question your skillfulness as a chess player. You might want to spare your opponent an embarrassing defeat, or you might have been bribed to make a bad move, or perhaps you've simply lost any interest in continuing to play. In neither of these cases would it be shown that you're somehow not skillful at playing chess, right? None of these cases undermines our ascription of skillfulness to you as a chess player, right? And now contrast this with an example of virtuous action, acting kindly. Suppose you encounter a person in need of your immediate assistance. You recognize the situation for what it is, and you're fully capable of providing relevant assistance. So other things equal, if you really are a kind person, you will provide relevant assistance. if you do not provide assistance, this certainly demonstrates a lack of kindness, because after all, acting kindly, assisting others in need, when and where kindness is called for, simply is what being a kind person is all about. Now, I think what these two examples bring out is the following. These are the lessons I would like to draw from these kind of examples, and there are, of course, countless others one could give. First, I think these examples suggest that virtue is a kind of power that disposes one to be unconditionally responsive to considerations that bear on what counts as right to do in light of the norms of virtue. That is, when a virtuous person realizes that fine is the right thing to do in light of these norms, then she will normally respond by fine, right? If she doesn't, or if a person is in a situation where it's clear that fine would be the virtuous thing to do, but this person is not fine, then this immediately raises questions about whether or not this person really is truly or fully virtuous. Right? Now, on the other hand, this skill is a kind of power that disposes its subject or its possessor to be only conditionally responsive to considerations that bear on what's right to do in light of the relevant skills norms. Conditional on an independent motivation to comply with these norms. And independent in the sense that the relevant motivation is not provided for or implied by the relevant skill itself. So when a skilled agent realizes that fine is the right thing to do in light of these norms, then this by itself doesn't settle whether or not she will actually fine. Whether or not she will actually fine will depend on an independent desire or an intention or a decision to engage the relevant skill and comply with the skill's norms. So another way of putting this is to say that skills need not be exercised. So, for example, the world's most skilled basketball player might be in a situation where he could easily score, but decide that he won't, for whatever reason, take the shot in that situation, right? That would not necessarily undermine her skill, right? By contrast, it's built into the possession conditions of a virtue that someone possessing a virtue is moved, other things equal, by considerations that bear on the virtuousness of their acts. Now, if we abstract from a specifically ethical profile of our examples, I think we can distill the following generic account of virtue from these examples, from these considerations. A given power is a virtue just in case it is a power whose exercises are unconditionally responsive to certain considerations that bear on what's right to do within that power's domain, that is relative to the fundamental norm or norms of that domain. Now, this is certainly schematic, and there are, various ways in which one might try to flesh this out further. What's important for our purposes here is to see that generic virtue predicts that qua subject of such a power, if you possess considerations that clearly show fine to be the right thing to do in light of the relevant norms, then this is sufficient for you to actually fine or to try to fine, given appropriate conditions. Right? That's the important implication of generic virtue for us. Why it's important, we will see in a minute. Now, with this in the background, let's move on to the resulting account of doxastic rationality. So, in brief, my proposal is that applying this general account of virtue to the case of rational belief formation will get us an account of such belief formation that is capable of vindicating IR. And we apply the general account to the case of rational belief formation by first viewing the belief-forming power of rational believers as one that disposes them to be unconditionally responsive to considerations that bear on the fundamental norm of the doxastic domain, roughly the domain of forming and maintaining beliefs. And second, by taking the fundamental norm of that domain, of the doxastic domain, to be the norm of truth, right, in line with many other philosophers. What this gets us is then the following account of doxastic virtue. A belief-forming power is a doxastic virtue, just in case it is a power whose exercises, namely particular instances of belief formation, are unconditionally responsive to considerations that bear on what's right to believe in light of the truth norm. That is just to say that these exercises are unconditionally responsive to the believer's possessed evidence, because evidence just consists in considerations that indicate truth or falsehood. Right? Now, again, there are various things one might and one should say about doxastic virtue. The important thing for us is, once again, the implication of this sort of virtue. Because just like generic virtue, doxastic virtue predicts that qua doxastically virtuous subject, qua possessor of the relevant sort of virtue, if you possess sufficient evidence for P, then other things equal, this is sufficient for you to believe P. And if you possess sufficient evidence against P, then other things equal, this is sufficient for you to believe not P. So, in other words, doxastic virtue vindicates IR. Qua exercise of a doxastic virtue, rational belief formation is immediately responsive to one's evidence. So it is because rational believers are doxastically virtuous believers that their belief formation is immediately evidence responsive. And this, the virtue account, according to which rational belief formation is immediately evidence responsive, because when forming beliefs in this way, you exercise the relevant doxastic virtue. Now, the upshots of this account, I think, are the following. First, virtuous agents and rational believers, I mean, if the foregoing is on the right track, then virtuous agents and rational believers are structurally similar in an important respect, namely with regards to the sort or the kind of responsiveness that they exhibit. So both virtuous agents and rational believers are necessarily or unconditionally responsive to considerations that bear on what counts as getting things right in their respective domains. Right? So typically, once it's clear that fying is the virtuous thing to do in a given situation, a virtuous agent will respond by fying, by trying to fy. There's no need nor room for any external incentives to respond in this way. And similarly, I think that once it's clear that there's sufficient evidence for P, a rational believer will normally respond by believing P. Again, there's no need nor room for any external incentives to respond in that way. And finally, I think that the virtue account is superior to the teleological account or the normative account because it's able to avoid the problems that we've considered, that we've discussed, which these accounts confront. So remember that the main problem with the teleological account is that on this account, we attempt to understand rational belief formation by ascribing an intention to believe the truth to a rational believer. But the problem is that the intention to believe the truth disposes believers to respond to their evidence in a way that can be defeated by other aims, like happiness. So, as you will remember, the teleological account predicts that a believer might not or might refrain from responding to their sufficient evidence for the truth of P, because doing so would frustrate some other aims that they're pursuing. For example, they would refrain from responding to their sufficient evidence for P because believing P would make them unhappy. Now, the virtue account, I think, avoids this problem simply because virtues equip their subjects with a necessary responsiveness to considerations that bear on the fundamental norms. Now, the problem with the normative account was that the mere fact that beliefs are constitutively subject to a truth norm doesn't by itself explain why any believers should be responsive to their evidence, should be responsive to considerations that bear on how to comply with the truth norm. Again, I think the virtue account is able to avoid this problem because what's doing the explanatory work on this account isn't the bare notion of constitutive normativity, but the notion of virtue. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, professor Davi. Antes da gente passar para a discussão e afins, eu só queria deixar claro que a lista de presença já está nos comentários, tá? Quem precisar. E agora eu vou passar a palavra para os debatedores, né? Para eles fazerem as suas próprias perguntas ao professor.
Pode começar, Severo. Depois passamos para o Vinicius e para o Pedro, caso eles queiram expor também.
Tá bom. Então, eu agradeço o convite, David, que tu me fizeste para eu participar. E, como sempre, esses teus trabalhos são de altíssima qualidade, então é até difícil, né, para mim, assim, formular perguntas, porque eu não sei bem se eu entendi tudo, assim, os detalhes, né, mas o que eu posso dizer antecipadamente é que me parece o teu trabalho super bem amarrado e construído, e fino, né, assim, na análise conceitual. Mas, vamos lá, então tu tem esse trabalho, ele tem uma crítica, né? Ele tem uma crítica de duas concepções, a concepção teleológica e a normativa, e depois...
Eu não tinha vindo mais.
O Severo travou. Acho que daqui a pouco ele vai. Vamos passar...
Voltou.
Sor, tu tinha travado, se tu puder retomar a tua sessão.
Ah, tá.
Acho que ele travou
Ainda
de
não
novo.
estamos lhe ouvindo. Sim.
Bom,
A gente pode passar para o próximo enquanto ele não retoma? Vinícius, quer colocar alguma coisa?
Tá.
Depois a gente retoma para o Rogério.
Tá. Estão conseguindo me ouvir bem?
Tô.
Tá, beleza, então. Bom, a pergunta que eu tenho é relacionado à distinção que tu fez entre virtudes e habilidades, eu vi que os exemplos que tu deu de distinções entre virtudes e habilidades são no reino da ética, não propriamente dito no reino epistêmico, no reino das crenças. Eu concedo, pelo menos do modo como eu entendi, eu concedo que habilidades e virtudes são diferentes em relação ao domínio da ética, mas eu não consegui ver isso, pelo menos no domínio no domínio epistêmico, em termos de crenças. Porque quando alguém exerce a sua habilidade intelectual, habilidade cognitiva, como os epistemólogos das virtudes entendem, como o Sousa, como o Greco entendem, por exemplo, percepção, no caso a visão, digamos, que se eu estou olhando para a rua agora, eu vejo que é noite. Eu formo a crença verdadeira de que é noite agora. E a partir da minha habilidade de percepção, minha habilidade intelectual de percepção, que é o modo como Sousa e o Greco entendem. A distinção que tu fez entre virtudes e habilidades é que eu posso não exercer essa habilidade enquanto, se eu estivesse exercendo uma virtude, eu não teria como não exercê-la e ainda ser uma pessoa virtuosa. No caso, eu poderia dizer que não é noite agora e ainda assim ter minha habilidade preservada. O que me pareceu estranho, parece que é essa consequência do que eu entendi do teu texto, mas só que se a gente tem essa consequência, parece que habilidades intelectuais são doxasticamente voluntárias. Aliás, voluntariamente doxásticas, desculpa. E isso me parece, acho que para todo mundo parece estranho que dizer que as nossas crenças são voluntárias. Então, parece que, essa é a pergunta para mim, que no reino epistêmico, eu não consigo ver tão claramente essa distinção entre virtudes, essa distinção que tu faz, né, que é crucial para a tua teoria, entre virtudes e habilidades. Eu queria que tu explicasse um pouco melhor.
Excelente, muito obrigado, Vinicius. Então, eu vou responder em inglês se está ok. So, exactly, I mean, you've described, I think the distinction between virtue and skill, exactly how I intend this distinction to be understood, and it is precisely because of that skill is the wrong model to understand epistemic competences, right? I think you're also exactly right on the way in which you've described how things go in the epistemic case, when we form beliefs, when we look outside and see it's night, and we respond immediately by forming the belief that it's dark outside or whatever, right? That there's no, it's not a matter of choice whether or not we respond in that way or not. We're necessarily responsive, right? That's the way I put it. But it's precisely because of that feature of our epistemic competence or powers that skill is the wrong model for these competences or powers. So my only complaint with regards to people like Sousa is, I mean, as you will know, Sousa's go-to example is archery. He attempts to understand epistemic competences on the analogy or on the model of archery skills. But my point is that this is the wrong model, precisely because an archer might be in a situation where he or she can take an excellent shot, right? A shot that is likely to hit the bullseye, to hit the target, but still decide not to take this shot, right, this would not automatically undermine their skillfulness at archery, right? But in the epistemic case, if I were to refrain from believing P when it's clear to me, or when I recognize that P is likely true, then this would reflect badly on my competence as a believer, right? So precisely because of that, I think that there is a crucial disanalogy which prevents us from, or which should prevent us from, trying to construe or understand epistemic competences on the model of archery, right? Rather, as I'm trying to suggest, epistemic competences should be understood on the model of virtue, right? Because virtues exhibit the same sort of unconditional responsiveness to certain situations that we also find in the epistemic case, right? So I think I agree with everything you said. I will just want to point out that this basically shows that skill is not the right model for understanding epistemic competences.
Sim, sim. Posso continuar?
Pode, por favor.
Pode?
Pode. Tampa um tempinho. Depois a gente passa para o professor Rogério.
Sim. Não, como toda analogia, né, ela tem certas limitações. No caso da analogia do Sousa, no caso do arqueiro, tem essa limitação de que o arqueiro ele pode se recusar a atirar, e ainda assim ele ser alguém habilidoso, enquanto no caso, no reino epistêmico, não seria o mesmo, a pessoa não seria racional se ela se recusasse a acreditar que agora é noite. Ela deixaria de ser racional, deixaria de um certo modo ser racional se ela passasse a acreditar que agora não é noite.
Sim.
Mas o que eu quis dizer é que parece que no reino epistêmico não tem essa diferença crucial que tu aponta entre virtude e habilidade. Esse era o meu ponto.
Tá, ok, perfeito.
Então, como eu não vejo essa distinção crucial, porque, né, no reino epistêmico a gente não tem esse voluntarismo, parece que não tem nenhum problema em usar o modelo de habilidades para resolver o problema de como conceber os crentes racionais em termos de imediata resposta à evidência.
Right. I mean, again, I would think that. Sorry. No, again, I would think that the analogy with skills generates wrong predictions in the epistemic case, and that the sort of normativity, or the sort of evaluations that we find in the domain of skill, the domain of archery, for example, is very different from the one that we find in the epistemic domain, and that's why epistemic normativity is not just a special case of skill normativity, right? Because well, for the differences, for the reasons that I've tried to point out. First. Second, I do think there is an analogous difference between virtue and skill in the epistemic realm as well, because I mean, I think that, I mean, there are epistemic virtues just and there are epistemic skills. Like, think of your calculating abilities, right? You can these are powers that you can exercise at will, right? You can engage in calculation, and you you can stop doing so, right? You can engage in certain methods or certain ways of evidence gathering that or evidence ordering or assessment these are skills which you can engage in voluntarily. So I would think there are epistemic skills, but they differ from epistemic virtues precisely because, I mean, analogously to the practical case, precisely because their engagement in some important way depends on your decisions or your intentions. So again, I'm inclined to think that there's an exactly parallel distinction in the epistemic case between our epistemic competences that are at work in forming beliefs and certain epistemic skills, such as your calculating skills or your mathematical or arithmetical skills that are at work in whatever. I mean, can be at work in mental actions, can be also at work in physical actions, and then that are to a certain extent at least under your voluntary control, unlike the sort of competences or powers that are in work in believing, right? And of course, these powers they work together. They're interconnected in various important ways. Still, I think it's important to view that there are certain important structural differences between the way in which they operate. I hope that's somewhat helpful.
Perfeito. Professor Rogério, pode seguir.
Tá bom, obrigado. Desculpa por antes, caiu aqui, entendeu? Não sei o que houve. Então, eu tenho três questões, David. A primeira é sobre a abordagem funcional, functional account, que pulaste na apresentação aqui. Então, tu tem duas linhas gerais que tu criticas, né? A abordagem teleológica, a abordagem normativa, mas a abordagem teleológica tem dois tipos. Tu falaste apenas o primeiro, esse segundo tu não falaste. Mas tu rejeita todos eles, certo? E eu queria perguntar aqui sobre as razões pelas quais tu está rejeitando essa abordagem funcional. Porque a abordagem essa funcional, ela é descrita, tu apresenta ela da seguinte maneira: uma formação de crenças racional é imediatamente sensível às evidências, porque a formação de crenças consiste em operações de um sistema cognitivo subpessoal, cuja função é produzir crenças verdadeiras. E tu questionas o fato, né, dessa função que produz crenças verdadeiras ser legada aqui a um sistema cognitivo subpessoal, porque tu argumenta que os casos paradigmáticos de formação de crenças racionais não são produzidos dessa maneira subpessoal, e tanto é assim que a gente é capaz de oferecer razões para louvar ou criticar, né? Quando uma pessoa diz que acredita em tal coisa e ela está certa, a gente louva ela por isso, e quando a pessoa acredita em uma coisa falsa, a gente critica ela. Só que a gente não faria isso se essas formação de crenças fossem, digamos assim, inconscientes, né? Elas acontecessem automaticamente, sem o controle da pessoa, como, por exemplo, tu dá o exemplo do sistema digestivo. Ninguém critica outra pessoa porque ela tem má digestão, por exemplo, né? A pessoa está com dor de barriga, né? Então tu dizes, bom, então esse não é um modelo adequado para a crença racional. A crença racional tem que ser primariamente consciente. Mas eu queria te questionar sobre isso, porque parece que uma boa parte das crenças racionais que a gente tem são produzidas, pelo menos em parte, por processos inconscientes ou subpessoais. Por exemplo, a percepção, né? A percepção. Eu não tenho, assim, eu olho para um objeto e imediatamente eu formo a crença. Eu olho para um objeto azul aqui do meu lado, vermelho, e imediatamente eu formo a crença de que há um objeto azul ou vermelho ao meu lado. E eu não tenho nenhuma consciência dos processos que levaram à formação dessa crença. O processo de formação de crenças é inconsciente. Da mesma maneira, quando a gente tem, assim, por exemplo, um sujeito que é muito bom de matemática, né? Então, ele faz cálculos muito bem. Então, tu apresenta um número para ele, ele te dá a resposta rapidamente. Quando essas pessoas se tornam muito habilidosas nisso, né? Quanto mais elas praticam a matemática, né, mais inconsciente isso tende a ficar. Então, parece que há uma correlação assim invertida, né? Essas são as coisas lá que o pessoal, os inativistas, né, o Vinicius, o Eros, aí tem estudado essas coisas, não sei se o Pedro também, e eles chamam atenção para isso, né? Então, os processos, quanto mais habilidoso uma pessoa se torna em processos cognitivos, mais a tendência é disso se tornar inconsciente. Então, eu não sei então, eu te pergunto sobre isso, porque parece que tu está desconsiderando esses casos aqui quando tu faz essa crítica à abordagem funcional.
Yes, thank you. Very good. So, I mean, my main reason, as you I think pointed out correctly, my main reason for resisting the functional account is that, if you like, it situates irrational belief formation on a level where I think a crucial or essential feature of not just epistemic rationality, but rationality in general, is being lost. And this is precisely the fact that we can, I mean, saying that an attitude or an action is rational or irrational has implications for the normative standing of the subject, right? So, but this implication is lost if we, so to speak, outsource rational belief formation to some subpersonal cognitive systems, right? So that's all. I mean, that's all I'm saying. Now, how exactly we gonna understand the difference between subpersonal and person level attitude formation is then, I think, a further question, right? And one proposal might be that in personal belief formation there is some necessary involvement of awareness or consciousness, right? But certainly, if that was true, then we would have to understand that in a way that this does not undermine the immediacy of rational belief formation to the relevant factors. To for example, your example was perceptual evidence, right? So, but I mean, I'm not taking a stand on how exactly we are to spell this out. I'm merely, observing. I'm merely stating that, well, if we move, like, so to speak, if we move downstairs to subpersonal cognitive systems in order to solve this problem, we lose what seems to be an essential connection, namely the connection between rational assessments and the normative standing of the person that qualifying or assessing certain attitudes as rational or irrational has normative implications, at least in some sense of normative, for the subject itself. This connection, this implication, just doesn't hold on the level of subpersonal systems like our digestive system, right? That's the only reason why I'm rejecting the functional account. I'm not rejecting the functional account because it does not give consciousness a prominent enough place. Whether or not the appeal to some sort of consciousness or reflectiveness in order to spell out the difference between subpersonal and personal is the right way to go is, I think, a further very complicated, very controversial question. And my opinion on that is that if that's the right way to go, then certainly we have to understand the relevant form of awareness or consciousness such that it does not interfere with the immediacy of the relevant form of responsiveness, right? But for the purposes of this talk, I think, or for the purposes of my argument, I don't want to take a stand, or I don't want to commit myself to any more specific way of spelling out the difference, or fleshing out the difference between the subpersonal and personal.
Ok. Eu vou voltar a esse assunto depois na terceira pergunta, tá? A minha segunda pergunta é sobre a normative account, a abordagem normativa. E essa é uma abordagem que diz o seguinte: se em que uma crença, a formação de crenças é racional, se ela é imediatamente sensível às evidências, por causa de que as crenças dos sujeitos essas crenças estão sujeitas a uma norma constitutiva de verdade. Mas aí quando tu apresentas tu apresentas essa concepção como contendo duas afirmações, né? Como implicando duas afirmações.
Uhum.
A primeira é que a parte em parte o que significa ter uma atitude, para uma atitude ser uma crença, é que ela está sujeita a uma norma, de tal modo que a crença é correta se e somente se ela é verdadeira. Então, o sujeito é racional se ele está sujeito a uma norma de verdade. A crença é racional, a formação de crenças é racional se ela é constituída ou está sujeita a uma norma de verdade. E essa norma de verdade é tal que a crença é correta se ela é verdadeira, certo? É isso?
No, not exactly. So the idea is that, I mean, everyone agrees that rational belief formation is belief formation that's immediately responsive to our evidence. And now we want to know what it is about believers, rational believers, and their way of belief formation that vindicates that view of epistemic or doxastic rationality. And the normative account says that, well, rational believers are immediately evidence responsive because, first, belief as such is subject to a norm of truth, of correctness, and second, that rational believers are such that they necessarily recognize or accept this norm. That's the that's the normative account, right? These two things are supposed to then account or explain why rational believers are immediately responsive to their evidence, and in that sense count as doxastically rational.
Sim, eu não sei se eu entendi bem então essa parte, porque depois tu apresenta razões para rejeitar essa concepção e aí tu dá como exemplo o caso da asserção, né? Porque as asserções também estariam sujeitas uma norma desse tipo, né? Quando a gente assere alguma coisa, essa asserção é aceitável se ela é verdadeira, ela não é aceitável se ela é falsa. Então, nós estamos sujeitos a esse mesmo tipo de avaliação, mas, obviamente, nós podemos fazer asserções falsas. Então, para mim não ficou claro, porque me parece que o caso da asserção me parece diferente do caso da crença, né? Tu chega a discutir isso mais adiante. Mas tu rejeitas essas razões para considerar isso como sendo relevante, né? Eu acho que, para mim, ficou parecendo que o caso da asserção é diferente, porque no caso da crença, se eu aceito a maneira como tu apresentaste aqui, né, a abordagem normativa, dizendo que a crença racional é constituída, né, por essa subjeção à norma da verdade, se eu aceito essa constitutividade, então me parece que não tenho como ter uma crença que quer dizer assim, parece que se algo não está sujeito a essa norma, segundo essa definição, então não é uma crença racional. Isso é diferente do caso da asserção, me parece. Porque no caso da asserção pode haver esse descolamento aí entre a verdade e a assertividade, né? Eu posso ter uma asserção que é falsa. E no caso, mas se eu defino dessa maneira o que é ser racional, o que é para uma criança ser sensível às evidências, se eu defino dessa maneira, que significa que ela é constituída por uma sujeição à norma de verdade, então isso parece impossível. Então parece que tem uma diferença entre o caso, parece que tem uma diferença entre o caso da asserção e da crença.
Right, thanks. So, I mean, maybe my criticism of the normative account in the most general terms is that being subject to a constitutive norm does not by itself imply that one is motivated or moved to comply with that norm, right? Constitutive normativity does not give us that, but that's what we want. That's what we need in order to account for immediate evidence responsiveness. Now, I do, of course, part of my point is that believing and affirming are very different. But my point is that their difference, or at least rational belief, is very different from affirmation. But their difference does not consist in the fact that the one is subject to constitutive norm and the other isn't, right? According, at least to many views, also it is part of the sort of speech act that is affirmation, that a correct affirmation is a true one, right? Mm-hmm. And so some people say that it is part of the sort of attitude that the belief is that a correct belief is a true one, right? And I'm saying that this might be true, and it might also be true that we recognize that, or at least insofar as we are rational, that we recognize and accept that. But these two things taken together, they will not explain why I am necessarily moved to form beliefs in response to considerations that show those beliefs to be correct in light of the constitutive norm. Being subject to a constitutive norm by itself does not entail that we're motivated to comply with that norm, always. And this is what is brought out by the case of affirmation.
Yeah. Okay, but if you don't comply with that norm, then you're not being rational. Isn't that
the norm is just the correctness norm. The norm says that a belief is is correct if true, and an affirmation is correct if true. But I mean, there's a huge difference between rationality and correctness. I mean, you can have rational beliefs that are not correct, and you can form correct beliefs that are not rational, right? It's not the same, right? I mean, the correctness norm is not the norm of rationality, right? It's just the normative account. The correctness norm is part of the explanation of rationality.
Evidence responsiveness is constituted by being subject to that norm, right? That's
the normative account says that evidence responsiveness requires two things: belief being constitutively subject to the norm of truth, and that rational believers somehow recognize or accept that.
Ok. Bom, não sei se bom, vou ter que voltar isso aqui depois, porque eu não sei se eu entendi. Não está claro ainda para mim porque exatamente por que tu acha que a asserção seria bom contra-exemplo, né?
Because it's also a case where something is subject to constitutive norm, and that's recognized by most of us. But this does not show that we're necessarily motivated to conform to this norm, because it's simple. I mean, it's simple. I mean, lying is possible.
Okay, but what I'm not getting is where is this motivation requirement coming from? Because if you're talking about something being constituted by something else, then by definition it cannot be otherwise.
No, I mean the idea of constitutive norms in that context is that it is constitutive for belief or for affirmation that they can be evaluated as either correct or incorrect, depending on whether or not they conform to the norm of truth. That this norm is constitutive does not mean that we cannot violate this norm. Right? I mean, it's because that they're false beliefs.
Sure, but
they're false affirmations.
Doesn't it follow that if you do violate the norm, then you're not being evidence responsive?
No, because again, imagine a case where your evidence is misleading, right? You have really strong evidence that P is true, but your evidence, unfortunately, is misleading, and so you respond to your evidence, and in that sense you're rational, but you unfortunately form an incorrect belief.
Okay, well,
correctness and rationality are two different things. I mean, you can be rational. You can have a rational belief in the sense that you respond to your evidence. But this belief can still be incorrect.
Sure, I get that, but I'm not sure how is it that what role the notion of constitution is playing here, because usually when you talk about something constituting something else, then well, if the norm isn't satisfied, then you don't have the concept doesn't apply anymore. And
right, but if that were, but that's not how this notion is used in this literature, in this context. I mean, the idea that belief is constitutively subject to a constitutive norm just means that it would be a crazy idea if that idea meant that the norm of truth is constitutive for belief means that there are no true beliefs, then that there are no false beliefs. Then of course, that would be crazy.
No, well, I thought that what was meant was that if you are responsive to evidence, what does it mean to be responsive to evidence? It means that you are subject to a norm of truth, right? That's where the Constitution comes in. But if you are subject to a norm of truth, then whenever you deviate from that norm, you're not being rational.
Well, that
Right.
cannot be true because that's not the idea. I mean, that's not the idea of the normative account, and I think it's no one's idea really, because I mean, you can deviate from the norm of truth while being rational, and you can also, ignore all your evidence and believe P, and as it happens, P is true. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So you've been completely irrational, but just by coincidence, you've formed a true belief, and so in that sense, complied with the norm of truth while being rational. So these two things are different.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll have to reread this portion of your paper then, because I don't think I got it right. Anyway, I have another question, which is please. About your contribution.
Só rapidinho, antes de tu ir para a tua terceira pergunta, só como a gente entendeu um pouco nessas duas questões, eu gostaria de passar para o Pedro e depois a gente retorna para a tua pergunta.
Sim,
pode ser? Só se o Pedro não tiver nenhuma colocação, não sei.
Não, até tenho, mas não me importa se o professor Rogério quiser continuar.
Não, vai lá, Pedro, depois eu volto.
Ok. Bom, primeiro, boa noite, David. Obrigado pela apresentação, pelo paper. Boa noite aos demais. Tenho duas perguntas. A segunda é muito relacionada à pergunta do Vinicius. Me senti contemplado pela dúvida dele e vou tentar elaborar de um outro jeito. Mas a primeira pergunta é sobre a própria distinção, entre o modo como tu faz a distinção entre virtudes e habilidades, que parece implicar, bom, são tipos distintos de poderes, de potências, e parecem ser categoricamente distintos, quer dizer, um não é um tipo de outra. Eu não sei se eu estou interpretando corretamente, mas é justamente isso que me gerou uma certa dúvida, porque me parece que o modo como tu faz a distinção implicaria, bom, ou pelo menos é compatível com a gente conceber virtudes como um tipo de habilidade, certo? Quer dizer, se a gente conceber potências, powers, em geral, como definidas de acordo com as condições de satisfação, de sucesso do exercício dessa capacidade, bom, então parece que é possível, por exemplo, uma pessoa realizar um ato bom e não ser virtuosa, não ser uma pessoa boa por isso, por exemplo. Ou seja, a diferença entre virtude e habilidade, entre a posse de uma virtude e a posse de uma habilidade, seria simplesmente a resposta imediata e inequívoca dentro dos contextos apropriados, certo? Mas, enfim, isso faria da virtude um tipo de habilidade. Eu acho que isso acaba, já que tu trouxe o exemplo do cálculo, né? Se a gente concebe, em particular, o processo de formação de crenças como exercício de uma virtude, e o cálculo, tu mesmo disse, é um exercício de uma habilidade, certo? Parece, então, que a gente pode conceber o cálculo, o exercício de uma habilidade de calculatória, sem a formação de crenças. Isso me parece muito estranho. Porque se tivesse a formação de crenças face às evidências que tu tira dos passos calculatórios, tu teria, então, o exercício de uma virtude, ou seja, de uma capacidade distinta. E isso me parece muito estranho, porque me parece que, bom, se uma pessoa não forma a crença, seja qual for um espaço que ela dê, durante um cálculo. Se a cada passo ela não forma a crença de que x dividido por y é igual a z, parece que ela não está calculando. Então, o processo de formação de crenças parece ser constitutivo do exercício de uma habilidade, certo? De uma maneira que a tua distinção categorial entre habilidades e virtudes não deixa transparecer. E aí, indo na direção da pergunta do Vinicius, me parece que tu, tanto na tua abordagem, na tua proposta positiva, quanto nas críticas que tu faz à abordagem intencional, à abordagem funcional e à abordagem... qual é a terceira?
Normativa?
Normativa, isso. Parece estar pressupondo que o processo de formação de crença é uma ação intencional, o que é problemático, eu acredito, certo? Quer dizer, uma ação intencional. A comparação que tu faz no caso do account intencional, certo? O sujeito quer ir ao Louvre, quer visitar o Louvre, ele se depara com uma placa dizendo que a fila para entrar no Louvre está à esquerda, ele, então, se dirige à fila para a esquerda, e essa reação dele de se dirigir à fila à esquerda é uma ação intencional que ele realiza como meio para aquela ação final que ele quer, certo? Aquela ação intencional final que ele quer. Então, e tu compara isso com o processo de formação de crenças, quer dizer, o sujeito a responsividade imediata a evidências no processo de formação de crenças não pode ser devido às intenções do agente de crer verdadeiramente, porque outras intenções poderiam atrapalhar, certo? Eu não vou entrar nos outros dois, mas acho que tá claro que tu chama bastante atenção para um tratamento como se fosse uma ação intencional, o processo de formação de crenças, né? E acho que se a gente tirar isso de lado, talvez dê para salvar algo do account intencional. Tu disse que talvez quisesse voltar a isso, pode ser uma ocasião, então, né? Que é, bom, tu disse ali o account intencional é rational belief formation is immediately evidence responsive because when forming beliefs in this way, you intend to believe the truth. Isso é plenamente compatível com uma conexão entre intenções e evidências, que não vai no sentido de como eu reajo intencionalmente às evidências, mas no sentido de como as minhas intenções determinam a minha sensitividade a evidências, certo? Que, como o Rogério lembrou, é algo que está bastante em voga, quer dizer, nas ciências cognitivas. O modo como o que a gente quer fazer num momento determina aquilo em que a gente presta atenção, em primeiro lugar, e aquilo que a gente é capaz de fazer determina aquilo que a gente é capaz de prestar atenção, certo? Então, não sei, alguém que seja indubitavelmente competente em uma certa área, certo? Em coletar evidências para determinado tipo, sei lá, um neurocientista vendo evidências da efetividade de uma nova droga, enfim, para causar tais e tais efeitos. Se essa pessoa está pensando na briga que teve com a filha no café da manhã, é bem possível que ela passe reto por algumas evidências e não que estão na frente dela, quer dizer, nesse sentido, e, enfim, não deixe de ser sensível. Nesse sentido, a intenção em jogo de acessar a verdade de uma proposição é determinante para a sensitividade à evidência, certo? E, embora isso não torne o processo de formação de crença, de maneira alguma, uma ação intencional. É isso.
A lot. So let let me. These are excellent points. I mean, let me try to. I think there were three main points. The first one concerns was a question about how skill and virtues, epistemic virtues, relate, right? And I mean, I'm totally happy to acknowledge that, like, for example, in exercising your epistemic skills, for example, your calculating skill, you also need to form beliefs, right? So for a successful calculation, you also need to exercise your doxastic virtue of forming beliefs. But the fact that virtue is, in that sense, or epistemic competence is necessary for a successful exercise of your calculating skills doesn't make them the same kind of power, right? I mean, you can have one thing can be necessary for another without these two things being the same thing, or even things or instances of the same type. So, of course, I mean, I'm happy to acknowledge that epistemic virtues and epistemic skills have to work together. That does not imply that they're the same thing or the same kind of thing. The second point was about. I mean, I wasn't sure if I got that correctly, but it was about whether or not I am committed to thinking of belief formation as something intentional, or was it about? I mean, or was it another criticism of the intentional account in the sense that this account is committed to I mean, denying the involuntariness of belief formation.
Não, só me pareceu que ao criticar o account intencional, tu tá tratando o processo de formação de crença como uma ação intencional tu mesmo, no sentido de, bom, comparar o processo de formação de crença à reação a uma placa dizendo que a fila para o Louvre tá à esquerda, certo?
Yes, I mean, that's
também no account positivo, certo? Também na hora de comparar, por exemplo, com o exercício de virtudes práticas, assim, quer dizer, a ação de uma pessoa boa, de uma pessoa sábia, enfim, vai ser intencional em reação ao contexto.
Yes, but I mean, I'm not committing myself. Nothing that I say commits me to viewing, I mean, beliefs or belief formation as an intentional or voluntary process. I think what I point out is that epistemic competences and practical virtues resemble one another in one important respect, and that's in the kind of responsiveness that they exhibit to certain factors of their situations, and that responsiveness is in both cases unconditionally or necessary, right? And that's the aspect in which they resemble each other. They differ in that, for example, virtues manifest paradigmatically, at least, in actions, whereas epistemic virtues manifest in belief, and actions and beliefs are not the same thing. They're different in various respects, right? But that's all okay. I mean, what I need and what I'm trying to highlight in my positive account is just that we have certain kinds of powers on the epistemic side and on the practical side that those exhibit the same kind or the same modality of responsiveness, namely an unconditional one as opposed to a conditional one. That's all. I don't want to commit myself to the idea that beliefs are actions, or that beliefs are voluntary. The third point you mentioned, I mean, if I got this right, you said that our intentions, our desires, what we want, etc., may influence our sensitivity to evidence, and thereby actually, I mean, play a significant role in our belief formation. And I think this is right, of course. So, for example, if I have a certain desire to find out, well, how many shoes my neighbor owns, right? This will make me go over to my neighbor's apartment, make me open the door of the shelves there and start counting the shoes, etc., etc. I mean, of course, this will have an impact on which beliefs I form, by having an impact by what evidence is available to me. That once, I mean, I see, right? I open the thing where the person has their shoes, right? And I see, well, there are only 2 pairs, right? At that point, I will respond by forming the belief, well, there are 2 shoes. My neighbor only has 2 pairs of shoes, right? So the fact that I formed this belief has been indirectly influenced by my desire to know how many pairs of shoes my neighbor owns. But I mean, it's not up to me. It's not, I mean, up to whether or not, I mean, how I respond to the evidence that I discovered, right? At the moment where the evidence is there, where it's clear to me that, well, the answer to my question is 2 pairs, then my response by forming the belief that he or she owns 2 pairs of shoes is not something that is, again, up to or dependent on my intention to comply with the evidence that I uncovered. But of course, the fact that this evidence is there in front of me, right, is something that is causally dependent on my previous intention or desire to find out how many pairs of shoes my neighbor owns. Right? So, yes, there is an influence, an important influence that our desires and intentions play with respect to, I mean, what evidence we possess, and thereby also, I mean, what beliefs we form. But that does not make, I mean, evidence responsiveness itself something that's dependent on our intentions.
Ok, estou com vontade de triplicar, mas vou passar a palavra para o Rogério também, depois a gente continua, eu acho. A gente tá com...
Eu vou fazer a minha pergunta em japonês, porque o David é alemão, ele escreveu o artigo dele em inglês, nós estamos no Brasil, então, naturalmente, nós precisamos respeitar aquelas pluralidades filosóficas.
Por favor.
Tá bom? Não, a minha pergunta é sobre a terceira parte da caracterização da virtude doxástica. Virtude doxástica, então, virtudes em geral, né, tem que ser responsivas, eu não sei como é que se diz isso em português.
Sim.
Incondicionalmente sensíveis, talvez, incondicionalmente sensíveis ao contexto, incondicionalmente sensíveis
não
ao
dá para falar
responsível,
não,
responsível.
Isso não existe em português.
Eu não sei se
a gente inventa agora.
Podemos criar essa palavra, né? Não tem nenhum problema.
Eu estou inventando um monte de palavras cada dia.
O David inventou uma nova palavra, não tem problema. É uma palavra técnica, não tem problema. Talvez nem exista em português, em inglês isso também, não sei se existe. Mas, enfim, as pessoas... Não, na literatura tem. Mas, assim, eu não entendo... Olha só, a minha pergunta é, como é que tu concilia isso aqui, essa responsividade incondicional, com o que tu disseste sobre a abordagem funcional? Tá? Porque tu disseste assim, essa abordagem funcional não é interessante porque, né, nós estamos aqui delegando a capacidade de formar crenças racionais para um sistema subpessoal, talvez inconsciente, certo? Mas eu pergunto, como é que a gente poderia ter uma responsividade incondicional que não fosse também produzida por processos inconscientes? Porque os processos conscientes me parecem todos condicionais, né? Eu fico pensando razões, tem isso, tem aquilo, eu tenho que considerar isso, tenho que considerar aquilo. Então, as respostas, assim, refletidas, né, racionais, elas em geral não são incondicionalmente responsivas. Então, eu acho que é justamente esse o ponto do pessoal das virtudes éticas, né? Eles dizem assim, olha, em geral a gente age eticamente sem razões. A gente age eticamente porque nós temos, digamos assim, uma disposição, né, que foi incorporada, uma sensibilidade, a gente aprendeu a ver as coisas, o mundo de uma certa maneira, e a gente reage a uma injustiça automaticamente e sem pensar até. E às vezes tu começa a pensar, tu já não age daquela maneira. Mas a sensibilidade dela leva ela a agir daquela maneira. E aqui é a mesma coisa. Eu tenho uma virtude epistêmica, quer dizer, eu aprendo a ver o mundo de uma certa maneira e reagir ao mundo automaticamente daquela maneira. Mas se essa resposta é automática, ela é incondicional, melhor dizendo, não sei se é automática, mas se ela é incondicional, então ela tem que ter esses elementos inconscientes, subpessoais, que tu está rejeitando lá na abordagem funcional. Então, eu não entendi como é que tu concilia esses dois aspectos, ou eu não estou entendendo direito.
No, because I mean, I think that being immediately or unconditionally responsive to something necessarily, for example, implies that you're not conscious of your response. I mean, I don't see how that follows. You would have to add a bunch of other premises or thoughts to get to that conclusion.
The more unconditional a response is, the more unconscious it has to be.
Well, yeah, maybe I'm okay with that. I mean, I don't want to take a stand on whether. I mean, but it's like it's not that immediacy necessarily means that I cannot be conscious of my immediate responses. Right?
There are two things there. It's not just immediacy. It's also the unconditional aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm unconditionally responsive, and an ethically virtuous person is unconditionally responsive to certain aspects of her situation, such that she does not need. I mean, it's not an open question for her. When she sees someone suffering and she's capable of helping, then she will try to help. She does not need an independent desire or decision or intention independent in the sense that this is not itself implied or provided for by her virtue in order to respond, right? And that's the same. That's the same. With epistemic virtues, right? That's the point of comparison or similarity.
But when Aristotle speaks of virtues, ethical virtues, he says that they are acquired by a habit.
Yes.
Or by experience. So it has to be something that goes on at a subpersonal level, unconsciously.
Well, I don't think that that's what
it just can't work consciously. That because if you're reasoning for, if you're consciously reasoning, why am I doing this? What are the reasons? Then it will immediately cease to be unconditional, because you can always find reasons for and against whatever stupid thing you want to do.
Well, these are strong claims. So I mean, first of all, I think that
it's not so. I don't think it's a strong claim. I think there are plenty of cases in the history of science.
Right.
You've got alternative hypotheses for some given phenomena. Not only usually scientists, when they're trying to explain a given phenomena, their minds are occupied with formulating several different hypotheses. So, you can have reasons for saying that this is so and so, that or otherwise, and this is not an unconditional response to the evidence. This is a conditional response to the evidence, given the theories that you have. So if you're talking about an unconditional response, then it has to be something that goes on at a subpersonal level, like perception, right? So you see something blue, and immediately you form the belief that it's blue. You're not reasoning about anything. You're not saying, well, why is this blue? I just say, well, it is. This is what I'm seeing. So it's unconditional in that sense. But then, so it works for perception, but it might not work just as well for more theoretical reasons, theoretical beliefs.
Mm-hmm. No, but I mean, I think that I mean, sometimes, for example, it takes time and a lot of reasoning to figure out what the evidence actually points to, right? And once this is clear, then your response is immediate, right? You don't need a further intention to, comply with what your evidence points to, and that's the same in the case of virtues. I mean, sometimes it's you need to weigh some of your reasons whether or not to find out to figure out what the virtuous response in a situation is. Not all situations are obvious immediately, right? But once it is clear to you what the right thing to do is, then a virtuous person will respond. There's no need for a further desire, intention, or decision to comply with the moral or ethical demands of your situation, right? And in other cases, this might be obvious immediately, right? Just because we're immediately responsive to certain aspects of our situation, I think does not by itself entail that necessarily whether or not we're conscious of our responses or not. These are further questions. I'm not taking a stand on this issue, and I think I don't have to in this. For the purposes of this argument, right? Because, for example, skills. I mean, the exercise of our skills is often not, necessarily a conscious process, but in my sense, it is conditional, right? The exercise of a skill, because whether or not I exercise a skill will normally depend on a desire to exercise that skill, right? It's not that skills. I will not start exercising my building skills just because I see a bunch of bricks in front of me, right? Or I will not necessarily make a certain chess move or start playing chess just because I see a chessboard in front of me, right? So exercises of skills depend on a desire or decision to engage these skills. Skills are not self-engaging, if you want, right? But still, many of the once I've engaged in the skill, many of the moves that I will then make are moves that I'm not spending a lot of time thinking about. Right? Still, in my sense, skill is a conditional, in the sense explained, is a conditional. It's a conditional power, right? Unlike virtue. So I think, the distinctions that you draw attention to between unconscious, conscious, etc., they are very important, etc., but they do not. It's not immediately clear how they map on the distinction that I'm mainly interested in.
Okay, no, I think to make this point more forceful, I'd have to reformulate it. But I'm still troubled somewhat by the idea that you can have some unconditional response that doesn't require any subpersonal cognitive systems to work, because that seems to be exactly what Aristotle says about ethical virtues. Why wouldn't that be the case with epistemic virtues also? So, but
no, I mean, it all depends on how you understand the terms that you were using. I mean, there's of course there's a sense in which I can be okay with, yes. I mean, I don't think Aristotle would be happy with putting, I mean, virtues on the same level as our digestive systems.
No, but that's not a good example. No.
Well, that is a prime example of subpersonal systems of powers.
But that's not a good example.
So
because
but of course, I mean, it's part of my main point, right? That virtues in the practical and the epistemic case, possessors of virtues are immediately responsive to factors of their to aspects of their situations, right? And I mean, if you want to call this then this subpersonal or whatever, then that's fine. I mean, that might be a terminological issue then, but I mean, what you invite then is precisely these comparisons that you don't want, the comparisons with your digestive system, etc.
Well, that's an extreme case. Perception would be a better comparison, because perception is mostly goes on at a subpersonal level. So you see things around you, but you have no idea how they're formed in your mind.
Right. No, there's a way in which we can understand this, because I think perception is, forming beliefs, right, in response to what we see is a rational activity in my sense, right? And it's immediate, and so whether or not this, for example, implies necessarily that this is something that goes on unconsciously, I think is a further substantive question, right? I mean,
it has to be unconscious, David. It has to be. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. I mean, this is what the psychologists and neuroscientists say. I mean, why would you reject that?
Because it depends on.
So I think this is, this is what I most liked about your paper, that you're willing to say that it is unconditionally responsive. I don't mind these implications. What I don't understand is that why the problem that I'm pointing out is that there seems to be two things going on here in your paper. On the one hand, you're asserting this unconditional response to the evidence in the Doxastic case, but you're rejecting the subpersonal cognitive systems of the functional account.
Because, look, when I form a belief in response to what I see, right, I form a belief that there's a computer screen in front of me. I mean, it seems to me that I can come to know what I believe, or I can become conscious of what I believe in a very different way than, for example, I can come to know or become conscious of what's going on in my digestive system, right? I would have to do an empirical investigation or whatever, or cut myself open, or like, I don't know how, whatever, right? But the way I know of my own beliefs that have formed in response to my perception seems to be very different and more immediate. And I mean, whatever we want to call this, I think it's important that we hold on to this difference. So, but this difference, whatever this difference amounts to, it should not be necessarily cashed out in terms of immediacy and not immediacy or conditional or unconditional responsiveness, because in a way, many sub-person systems might be described as being unconditionally responsive or sensitive to certain factors, etc., right? But there's another difference, right, which has to do with the way in which we are conscious or can come to know about these responses, right? That I think sets these systems or these powers apart. But for the purposes of this talk, or for this argument, I think I don't want to enter into these issues. I just want to point out that by talking or using the term unconditional responsiveness or immediacy, I do not, or one is not committed to assimilating epistemic virtues or practical virtues to systems that work on a sub-personal level, such as our digestive system.
É bom, eu não vou dizer mais nada. Eu não vou dizer mais nada. Eu tô ficando com fome já, de tanto falar no sistema digestivo.
Bom, gente, já aproveitando a deixa, eu quero agradecer a participação de todos. Professor David, obrigado pelo convite, por aceitar nosso convite, professor Rogério, Vinicius. Sei que o debate podia ir a noite toda. Obrigado, Pedro, por participar, Horst, a Luísa e a Maria Fernanda, que estão no backstage. E lembrando que quarta-feira, dia 21, vai ter a palestra também do Eixo da Polaridades, de pornografia política, pela painelista Atena, que ela é escritora, poeta e educadora social, e a nossa colega do departamento, Euleia, que faz filosofia. Obrigada a todos, boa noite, obrigado, professores.
Muito obrigado pelo convite e muito obrigado pelas questões. Foi bem legal.
Eu também agradeço.
Obrigado, gente. Boa noite.
Agradeço também. Boa noite, professores, colegas.
E